Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to Fingtam Languages. Today's video is going to be about what it means to have correct English or German or Spanish or whatever language you're speaking. And this is a phrase that we use all the time. It's something that just seems totally normal to us. But today I hope to show you that what this phrase means, correct English, it's not as straightforward as you may think it has been. And this is a PowerPoint that I've made in relation to a class that I'm taking right now because I'm super swamped with school, so I just had to really quick pump out a quick video for you guys on this Monday because I didn't have a whole lot of time to make videos, so that's why I'm presenting my video this way. But in this video, I intend to address a very prevalent myth in our culture that is really a very silly myth, if you think about it. I'm going to talk about how this very common myth is easily disproven. It only just takes a little bit of thought to realize that this myth makes no sense. And I'm going to talk about how it has to do with our language learning and our languages in general, even in your native language. And I'm probably going to make you rethink everything you thought you knew about language if I do my job right. All right, so to start off, who decides what is correct and incorrect English or German or whatever? Is it your English teacher? Is it the people that write the dictionary? Is it the people that publish grammar books? University professors? Is it our distant ancestors? Who has the right to tell you what is correct English and what is wrong English? And if more than one of these groups of people is the authority on correct grammar, which one do we trust more? In other words, if one of these groups of people conflicts with the beliefs of another group on what constitutes correct English, then which one do we listen to when they're in contradiction to each other? And then once we've settled on one of these groups of people who gets to decide what is correct or incorrect, what gives them the right? Honestly, what makes us think that because someone publishes a dictionary, now all of a sudden I have to listen to him, right? These are probably something you've never thought about before, because it just seems totally natural that the people who write the dictionary, they have authority. But I'm going to show you a series of questions that kind of make that proposition a little bit more muddy. And it should be clear that it's not as straightforward as we oftentimes think this question is. In some languages, they have actual official governing bodies for the language that have been established by the government, like l'Académie Française, or that's in France, and then they have La Real Academia Española in Spain. They have similar things in Germany, and a bunch of other countries have official institutions that are like the guardian of the language, and they're the ones that the government has established to tell you what is or is not correct grammar in that language. But English has no official governing body. We don't have any of these academies like some other countries do. But that's really a non sequitur. It's a red herring, because even if our language did have a governing body that decides what is or is not correct, it still goes back to the question I asked in the last slide. What gives them the right to tell other people what is correct or incorrect? If the government establishes an institution or an academy that determines what is or is not incorrect, just because the government says so, then all of a sudden we have to listen to them and we have to believe everything they've told us about what the language is supposed to be like? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. That's not really satisfying, especially when you consider things like if you live in Mexico, do you have to go off everything that the Spanish government, the government in Spain, has decided is correct Spanish. If you live in Canada, do you have to believe everything that comes out of l'Académie Française, which has been established by the French government? That doesn't seem like it makes any sense. So it's a really hard question of deciding who it is that we're supposed to listen to, if in fact we're supposed to listen to anyone at all when it comes to correct grammar. And in reality, this is an impossible question to ask. Defining what is or is not correct, it really is impossible. It's not just difficult. It can't be done. And that's for a number of reasons. Languages are always changing, right? 1,000 years ago, the English language didn't even exist in the way that it exists now. They had Old English, which you would not even be able to understand unless you did extensive studying on Old English. And several hundred years before that, there was no English. It just had not been formed yet. There was nothing that in any way was English. They had Proto-Germanic and Proto-Indo-European, which were entirely different from what English is now. Another question is that languages exist along a continuum of dialects. So we can't just say that there is an American English or a British English. We can't just say that there is, one Chinese language that follows a certain set of rules. It just doesn't exist. These languages vary according to geography, according to social class, even according to gender. And there's no way that we can come up with one set of rules that would encompass everything that is the language in question. And even if you're just trying to distinguish the rules for just one specific dialect, there really is no clear scientific criteria about how that language should be viewed, whether as being correct or incorrect. We can scientifically study the aspects of the language, and that's what linguists do, but it's not clear about how we would be able to make good value judgments on what is good or bad English, other than just the way linguists study languages. All right. All languages are fully capable of expressing the entire range of anything that human beings would want to say. Okay? Now, you may have heard things like, the language you speak shapes your thought. Eskimos have 12 words for snow, so somehow they're more finely attuned to different types of snow than we are. That's silly. Can you think of any other reason that an Eskimo might pay more attention to snow than we would, besides the amount of words for snow that they have in their language? So my point with this slide, the thing I'm trying to get across, is that there's no language that is handicapped in its communicative ability. Okay? Every language is able to express everything you would want to express, and that goes for every dialect as well. Several centuries ago, English had a plural singular distinction in the second person pronouns. This is similar to tu and vous in French, and tú versus vosotros or ustedes in Spanish. But now we just have one word, you, which has to work double. It really has to pull twice as weight. It has to work for the singular second person pronoun and the plural second person pronoun. And we find ways to compensate for this, right? We didn't just lose the ability to communicate second person plural pronouns. That's silly. Once we lost the thou, thou ye distinction, we came up with other ways of communicating the same thing. So the language hasn't been degraded just because we don't have the word ye anymore. We now say y'all, you guys. Some people say yins. It depends on your region, but we all have mechanisms for coping with the lack of a second person pronoun. And the irony here is that a lot of people that use these forms, y'all, they get corrected and say that, no, that's not correct English, right? That it's a non-standard dialect, so you shouldn't say y'all. When in reality, they're just filling in gaps that have been left by totally normal language change. And if you study historical linguistics at all, this phenomenon is something that is completely normal. This is 100% absolutely normal and natural for languages to do. We don't talk the way they spoke 500 years ago. We have lost some of the things they said, and we have replaced it with new things. And trying to resist the change is just futile. All right, so the essential question that we have to ask ourselves when determining what is or is not correct grammar is, what is a language? And I know I'm asking really silly questions because everyone knows what language is, but it's not as clear as you think, I promise. You've probably just never thought about it before, but these are questions we have to ask ourselves if we're trying to be intellectually and scientifically consistent. As far as linguists are concerned, a language is a system of communication that allows humans to encode meaning in airwaves or in hand signs in the case of sign language. We also have, of course, written symbols, but linguists don't study that. Maybe a few people may study orthography, but by and large, linguists study the way you communicate using sound waves or hand signals. All right, now growing up in a literate society often gives us a skewed view of what a language is because of the way we're raised and the way our society works and the things that they tell us. In order to really get the essence of what it means to be a language, we're going to do a thought experiment. And we're going to go back to what it would have been like to live in the time before they invented writing. Or go into, pretend we're a tribe in the rainforest who has never seen a book or a pen or a paper or a letter. And this is really going to help us hone in on what it means to be a language. Because these people have languages, right? They don't have writing, they don't have dictionaries, they don't have grammar books, but they have a language. And their language is every bit as able to communicate every bit of anything they might want to communicate just as much as English. Their language is not hindered because they don't have dictionaries. Go back. So you live in the rainforest, you've never seen a dictionary, and really, for you then, what your language would seem to be is just a puff of air that comes out of your mouth, and then it's gone forever. And in that sense, you would have no idea what your great-grandparents sounded like, the things that they might have said, the words that they used. Every generation changes its language a little bit. I bet you don't speak the same way your grandparents speak, or if you're fortunate enough to know your great-grandparents, I bet you don't speak like they spoke. You use different vocabulary, different grammatical words. This is true for every culture. And in cultures where they don't have writing or video recording, once that generation dies, it's just lost. So there's no reason to believe that the way that they spoke was any more correct than the way that you're speaking right now. These are different linguistic systems, different dialects, but one is not more correct than the other just because one came before the other. So, if you can imagine putting yourself in this context where you've never even seen a book and you're just living in a tribe where your language really is just a puff of air that is that just is there 1 second and then gone. It's a little easier to think to yourself, well, in that case, there really is no such thing as just a correct or incorrect grammar. You can't imagine a tribeswoman in New Guinea or in deep in the jungles of Africa saying like, well, no, Timmy, you're not supposed to split your infinitives, right? They're not worried about these things because they have kind of a more highly evolved idea of what language is than we do. We've been a little bit hindered because we have a literate society. Of course, I'm not saying that literacy is bad. I'm just saying it gives us some strange ideas of what it means to be a language. And of course, if you know anything about linguistics, what I'm talking about here is the idea of descriptivism versus descriptivism. Or what, did I say that right? It's prescriptivism versus descriptivism. And we're going to talk about what these two terms mean. They're very common in linguistics, and they're really essential to the study of language. Now, if a linguist were going to go into the rainforest and study this tribe that has no writing, no books, no dictionaries, it's a newly discovered tribe, and the language is we have no previous record of their language. And this is really exciting because linguists are like, yes, new material, new data to go study. They're going to go into the rainforest, and how are they going to study this language? They're not going to bring a grammar book and tell the people, this is how you're supposed to speak, right? What they're going to do is they're going to take a notebook and a pen, and they're going to write down exactly the way the people actually speak, okay? And it doesn't matter how these people's great-great-great-great-grandparents spoke, right? Because those people are dead, their language is gone. They presumably spoke different than the way people speak now. But that history of their language is not necessary for us to make the claim that these people's language is valid just as the way that it is right now. And presumably, in the way they speak their language right now, they're using words like ain't, in which their grandparents probably may have shunned those words, but these people just use these words and it's just part of their everyday life. This is true linguistics, when you're studying the way a language is. So if a Martian were to come to Earth right now and study English, if they applied the same principles as we would apply to this tribe in New Guinea, then the Martian would look at the way we speak, they would hear us saying ain't, and they would just assume that's part of the language. That's the way these people speak. We're not prescribing a new way that you're supposed to speak. We're just describing the way they actually speak. And this is the scientific view of language, okay? Like I said, there's no real difference in communication ability between that language in New Guinea or English. They're not able to communicate any less because they speak differently than their great-grandparents. And in English, people who use the word ain't, or people who use the word literally to mean figuratively, these people are not any less able to communicate than the prescriptivists who your English teacher who told you there's a certain way to speak English and a certain way to not speak English. And just a note on the literally thing. I know this is something that gets people really impassioned, right? Because you're not supposed to use literally to mean figuratively. These are two opposite things. If you're the kind of person who uses literally to mean literally or figuratively, you're still able to communicate the full range of human communication, of anything that you would want to communicate. You are not hampered in your ability to communicate. And I know this is a common belief, but it's just wrong. You can still communicate the difference between literally and figuratively. Sorry, I got out on a tangent there. Yeah, so English speakers have a long history of just believing we have to believe whatever my English teacher tells me, and we have to study really hard, and if I forget the things that my English teacher told me, then I'm speaking wrong English. And that's just part of our society, and that goes back to the thing I said earlier about the tribes people, right? Because their idea of what a language is not hindered by the same English classes and books and stuff that we've had that kind of skew our idea of what it actually means to be a language. All right, and now it gets to the question of the hour. Is ain't a word? And this is a question because, at least in my family, growing up, it was always a question. My grandmother was an English teacher, and she always corrected our English. And if we used the word ain't, my mom would tell us, that's not a word because it's not in the dictionary. So don't say ain't, say isn't, or aren't, or weren't. Question, is ain't in the dictionary? The simple answer is yes. It is. Ain't it's in some dictionaries, for sure. But really that's kind of missing the point. Who cares if ain't is in the dictionary or not? Do you believe everything that the guy who wrote the dictionary says? I mean, do you even know the guy who wrote the dictionary? What makes you have to trust him more than anything, like anyone else who says ain't is a word? What gives him the authority? Who died and made him the king of the English language, right? This is not the right question to be asking. The question to be asking ourselves is, what is a word? What does it mean to be a word? And I'm going to give you a definition, ironically, from the dictionary. I'm not saying dictionaries are bad. They're very useful tools if we use them in the right way. And so the definition of the word is a single distinct meaningful element of speech or writing used with others, sometimes alone, to form a sentence and typically shown with a space on either side when written or printed. So now that we know what a word is ain't a word? Yes! It's a word! It's a word by every definition of the word. I don't understand why this is still a question. To be 100% honest, you could make the arguments that ain't is actually two words, right? Because it's a contraction. So in that case, it's actually pulling double duty. It's more of a word than some of the other words we use, right? So I hope I've convinced you that prescriptivism is dumb, that there's not one correct way of speaking, that speech is much more of a muddy, flowing together, really hard to peg down way of communication. Now, I will say though that there are certain times where you want to avoid the word ain't, right? If you're at a job interview, specifically if you're interviewing to become an English teacher, you do want to avoid this word. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we should all just abandon everything our English teachers taught us. What I'm saying is that this word is not less correct than the word isn't. Like I said, this is a topic that I'm very passionate about because I too fell prey to this misconception a long time ago when I was in English class. And the reason I'm passionate about it is because everyone seems to be fooled by what it means to have correct grammar. And it's just such a prevalent myth that doesn't make any sense. And if you just do a little bit of thought into who gets to decide what would be correct grammar or not, then it's very clear that it doesn't make any sense. So take this for, as what you will. You can take it as as a license to use the word ain't. You can take it just as some interesting knowledge. If you speak a dialect where you don't use the word ain't, and it's just not part of your lexicon, it's not part of your idiolect, then you don't have to use it. If you don't like the aesthetic sound of this word, if you think it sounds uneducated, then by all means, keep speaking the way you're speaking. Because the way that you're speaking right now, the way that I'm speaking right now, these are all valid linguistic systems. And there's no reason that you should have to speak any way other than what naturally comes out of your mouth. And that also brings me to one other point, now that I'm thinking about it. There is one way to speak incorrectly. And that is... I'm getting notifications. The only way to speak incorrectly is if you are a non-native speaker, which many people who are watching my channel are non-native speakers of a language. And that's because grammatical language is defined as natural speak that comes from a native speaker. Native speakers use the word ain't. So this is definitely a word. And if you're a non-native speaker of English, use the word ain't. There's nothing wrong with that. There are some rules that native speakers follow always. And I didn't intend to keep going this long, but I'm going to go on another side rant right now. In English, we have a certain order that we're supposed to apply adjectives to the word. So a native speaker of English, at least in most dialects of English, a native speaker will say the big red barn, because for whatever reason, adjectives of size are supposed to come before adjectives of color. So big red barn. If you were to say a red big barn, that just sounds wrong to most native speakers. And that actually does violate a rule of English grammar. Now, if you are a non-native speaker of English, and you say, I see a red big barn, you have just violated a rule, and that is incorrect. But native speakers don't do that. So that's why we call it a rule. And so I don't want to sound like I'm contradicting myself. A rule of grammar is based off of what native speakers say. Okay? A linguist can go study those rules, right? We can go to the rainforest, find the tribe, listen to the language that we've never heard before, and we can find patterns that those native speakers follow when they're speaking their native language. And then in order to learn that language, we're going to show these patterns and these rules to non-native speakers, and we're going to try to get them to follow those rules. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean we just go up making rules for no reason. Like the rule that you can't split your infinitives, the rule that you can't end a sentence with a preposition. These rules are made up. English teachers, or presumably somewhere down the line, someone was writing a grammar book and they just said, well, Latin doesn't have split infinitives, so neither can English. Well, you know what? English isn't Latin. Latin can't have a split infinitive because that's the way Latin actually is. That's a real rule in Latin. That's not a real rule in English. Someone made that up. The thing about putting prepositions at the end of you can't put a preposition at the end of your sentence. It's silly because someone kicks you in the foot and you say, hey, what did you do that for? Right? You're ending a sentence with a preposition. And it sounds normal. It sounds fine to the ear of a native speaker. So you are not violating a rule. Now, in order to follow the rule that your English teacher wants you to follow, instead of saying, what did you do that for? You would have to say, for what did you do that? And that doesn't even sound right. That sounds weird. No one speaks like that. It's not a rule of grammar. So, as you can see, I am very passionate about this subject because it just doesn't make any sense. I like things to make sense. And I'm going to leave it with that because this video is half an hour long already, and I did not intend to speak this long, but I just got ranting, And I I just love grammar. I love English. I love languages, and this is really interesting stuff to me. I hope it's interesting to you. So that's all I have for this video, and we'll see you guys on Friday.